I was never good at staying still. My teacher always said I had too many questions in my head, questions that made me restless. I didn't like sitting in the classroom while everyone else copied notes about kings and wars. I liked stories that started far away from people, in times when the earth itself was younger, and animals ruled the forests. My grandfather told me once that our family was like a tree with deep roots, and the roots stretched far into a past that no one could see. That's when I began to wonder
This
not just about
environmental
my family
stress
tree,
pushed many
but about the
primates,
biggest tree
some
of
toward
all,
extinction,
the family tree
others
of
toward
humans.
adaptation.
One summer afternoon, I found myself reading an old magazine in my uncle's study. The pages smelled dusty, but the pictures caught my attention. Fossils, bones, strange faces of ancient creatures. There was one drawing in particular, a hairy ape with deep eyes and a serious look, standing on two legs in a forest. The caption said, Ouranopithecus macedonensis. I said the name aloud, and it felt heavy on my tongue, like a secret word from another time. Ouranopithecus. It meant ape of the heavens. At first, I laughed. What kind of name was that? But then I thought about it, maybe the scientists gave it that name because they found it in Greece, the land of ancient gods, where people always looked up to the heavens for answers. I read that the fossils were discovered in northern Greece and parts of Macedonia. They lived almost 9 million years ago. That number felt impossible to me. I couldn't even imagine what the world looked like that long ago. But the more I thought about it, the more I wanted to see it in my mind, to walk there as if I was really part of that time. So I closed my eyes and let the story build itself inside me. The air was heavy, warm, and filled with the smell of wet leaves. The forest stretched out far and wide, with trees that bent under the weight of green vines. Rivers cut through the land, their waters muddy and slow. On the edges of the forest, grasslands rolled like waves, yellow under the sun. And somewhere between those forests and grasslands, a group of apes moved carefully. They weren't like the chimpanzees I saw on TV, though they had the same long arms and broad chests. They weren't gorillas either, even though their jaws were strong. These were Ouranopithecus creatures caught between two worlds, not quite like the apes of today, and not yet like the humans of tomorrow. I imagined a female sitting on a tree branch, her dark eyes watching the grass below. She chewed on something hard, maybe a nut or a fruit. I knew from the article that Ouranopithecus had huge jaws and strong teeth, built to crush tough foods. The forests of Greece back then weren't as soft and sweet as the tropical jungles in Africa. Food was harder to find, and survival meant being able to eat whatever you could. Nearby, a young male swung down from the branches, his knuckles brushing the earth. He paused, lifted his head, and looked toward the horizon. The grass moved as if the land itself was breathing. Maybe it was just the wind. Or maybe it was the sound of hooves, ancient horses running, or horned antelopes searching for water. These apes didn't hunt, but they lived beside the great animals of their time, always alert, always cautious. I could almost hear the buzzing of insects, the cries of birds, the soft crack of branches as the apes moved. And then I realized something: this wasn't just a picture in my mind. This was part of the long story of us. When I thought about Ouranopithecus, I didn't see them as strangers. They were like distant relatives, faces hidden in the shadows of time. We didn't come directly from them, I learned, but they might have been close to the line that led to humans. Some scientists said they were part of the great ape family, cousins of gorillas and chimpanzees. Others believed they might have been closer to the roots of humans. No one was completely sure. But what mattered to me wasn't who was right or wrong. What mattered was that they existed that 9 million years ago, in a land now filled with olive trees and ruins of temples. There had once been forests alive with creatures who might have carried a spark of what we would one day become. I pictured walking through that forest myself, barefoot, my hands brushing the rough bark of trees. Would they notice me? Would they accept me as one of their own? Or would they vanish into the branches, leaving me alone with the echoes of their cries? the boy inside me, the one who didn't like classrooms, felt something stir. Maybe learning history wasn't just about kings and battles. Maybe it was about learning where our story began, in places no one remembers, with creatures no one thinks about. Ouranopithecus wasn't famous. Most people had never heard of it. When we talk about human ancestors, everyone jumps straight to Australopithecus in Africa, or the Neanderthals in Europe. But there were others, shadows on the edge of the story. Forgotten apes. Silent branches of the family tree. And yet, without them, the tree wouldn't make sense. The magazine said something that stuck with me: fossils of Ouranopithecus were rare. A few jawbones, some teeth, parts of skulls. Just fragments. From those pieces, scientists tried to rebuild a whole life, a whole world. That amazed me. How could anyone imagine so much from so little? It was like trying to write a story after finding only 3 words of a lost book. But maybe that's what humans are best at. We are storytellers. We take broken things and try to understand them. We look at bones and imagine flesh, we see stones and imagine tools, we see ruins and imagine cities. And maybe that habit started long before history. Maybe it's what made us human in the first place. As I sat there with the magazine in my lap, I felt like I had discovered a hidden key. Ouranopithecus wasn't just an ape. It was a reminder. A reminder that our past is longer, stranger, and deeper than we usually think. And as the sun went down outside my uncle's window, I promised myself I would keep following that story, branch by branch, ancestor by ancestor. Because maybe if I kept looking, I would finally see how the boy sitting in a room with dusty books was connected to the ape of the heavens, who once chewed fruit in a forest 9 million years ago. When I first read about Ouranopithecus, I thought of them as creatures hidden deep in the forest, swinging from branches like today's chimpanzees. But the more I learned, the more I realized their world wasn't just trees and vines. It was a world in between, where the forest thinned out and the grasslands began. That edge, that in-between place, was where their story unfolded. I tried to imagine what it must have felt like for them. In the forest, there was safety. The tall trees gave shelter, the leaves offered food, and the branches were ladders to escape danger. But the grasslands stretched wide and open, filled with sunlight and danger alike. Big predators could hide there, waiting. And yet, the grasslands also meant new food, new chances, new life. It was like standing at a doorway behind you, the world you know, ahead, the world that might change everything. I thought about one Ouranopithecus mother, cradling her young. She sat on a low branch, her dark fur blending with the shade. The little one clung to her, its tiny hands gripping tight. She watched the grassy plain with careful eyes. Maybe she saw the shapes of ancient horses running across the horizon, or herds of animals moving like rivers. She probably felt torn. Part of her wanted to stay in the forest, but another part knew the future was calling out there, beyond the trees. The scientists said Ouranopithecus was different from earlier apes. Their jaws were heavier, their teeth stronger, built to crush not just fruits but harder, tougher plants. That told me something important: they were learning to survive in a harder world. Maybe the forests were shrinking, the weather was changing, and food wasn't as easy to find. If you could only eat soft fruits, you'd starve. But if your teeth could crush nuts, roots, or hard seeds, you'd last longer. That's how evolution works: slow, silent changes that make survival possible. No one notices at the time. An ape doesn't wake up thinking, "I'm evolving." But thousands of years later, the difference is there, written in the bones and teeth. Sometimes, I thought about myself in comparison. I wasn't the strongest in my class, and I wasn't the fastest either. But I was good at asking questions, at imagining things. Would that matter if I lived in a forest 9 million years ago? Maybe not. But today, maybe that skill of imagining stories and asking questions was my way of surviving. It made me wonder, do we all carry pieces of survival from the past inside us, shaped not by muscles but by something else? I like to picture a young male Ouranopithecus wandering further than the others. Maybe he left the shade of the trees and stepped onto the edge of the grassland. The sun burned hotter there, and the ground felt different under his feet. He squinted as he walked, scanning for danger. A herd of antelope looked up, startled, then ran, their hooves kicking up dust. For a moment, he stood still, breathing hard, watching the herd vanish. Did he feel curiosity, the way I do? Or fear? Or maybe both at the same time? That moment, that step out of the forest, felt important. Because much later in history, humans would leave forests too. We would walk across grasslands, chase animals, use tools, and explore lands far away. But here, maybe for the first time, an ape was tasting what it meant to live between two worlds. The article I read said that some scientists believe Ouranopithecus could have been close to the ancestors of humans. Others think they were more like cousins, related but not direct ancestors. For me, that argument didn't matter much. What mattered was that they showed the possibilities. They proved that evolution wasn't a straight line but more like a tree, with many branches spreading out in all directions. Some branches grew tall, some broke off, and some carried the seeds of what would come next. I thought of the tree in my grandfather's backyard. Its trunk was wide and old, but the branches stretched out wildly. If I followed one branch, I ended up in the sunlight. If I followed another, I was lost in shadow. That's how I saw human evolution now, a tree full of chances, not a single path. Ouranopithecus might have been one of those branches that reached out but didn't continue. Maybe their line ended. But even so, they mattered. Without them, maybe the tree would have grown differently. Maybe without them, there would be no humans at all. One evening, as I sat on the roof of my house staring at the sky, I thought about their name again, ape of the heavens. It felt fitting. They were caught between earth and sky, between trees and grass, between what was and what could be. That's what made them so fascinating. They weren't just animals. They were a story of transition. And when I thought about their world, the buzzing insects, the crunch of seeds in their jaws, the nervous glance at predators hiding in tall grass, I felt a strange connection. I was living in a modern city, surrounded by lights and machines, but part of me was still that boy on the edge of a forest, staring out at the unknown. Maybe that's why their story mattered so much. Because even though millions of years have passed, we're still standing at the edge of change, still looking out at new horizons. We're still the children of creatures who dared to step out of the forest. I held the magazine close to my chest, as if I could hold the past inside me. Ouranopithecus was more than a fossil. It was a reminder that we came from wanderers, from survivors, from dreamers who didn't even know they were dreaming. And maybe that's what it means to be human, to keep moving forward, even when we don't know exactly what waits for us beyond the trees. When I closed my eyes and tried to see the world of Ouranopithecus, I realized something: they weren't alone. 9 million years ago wasn't just about one species in one place. It was part of a much bigger picture, a whole world of apes, animals, and landscapes we can hardly imagine now. Scientists call that time the Miocene epoch, and it lasted from about 23 million to 5 million years ago. That number sounded huge to me at first. Millions of years. My teacher used to complain that I couldn't even focus on a 30-minute lesson, so how was I supposed to wrap my head around millions of years? But then I thought of it differently. The Miocene was like a giant book, and each million years was a new chapter. If I read carefully, I could see how the story of life kept changing from page to page. The Miocene was sometimes called the Golden Age of Apes. I liked that name because it sounded like something out of a legend. And in a way, it was true. Apes weren't rare back then like they are today. They lived all over Africa, Asia, and Europe. Each kind was slightly different, some small and nimble, others big and powerful. Some clung to forests, while others dared to step into open lands. It was as if nature was experimenting, trying different versions of what an ape could be. Ouranopithecus was one of those experiments. But there were others too. In Africa, there were apes like Proconsul, one of the earliest big ones, living around 20 million years ago. They didn't have tails like monkeys, and they already had some features that looked a little closer to ours. In Europe, there were apes like Dryopithecus, with long arms that probably swung gracefully through trees. And in Asia, there were apes like SavageTouch, which looked a lot like today's orangutans. I imagined them as characters in a grand story, each living in their own chapter, their own corner of the world. Some would disappear, their line ending quietly. Others would pass along traits that traveled through time, eventually reaching us. What fascinated me most was how the world itself was changing. The Miocene wasn't frozen in one moment, it was alive with shifts. At the start, much of the earth was warm and full of forests. But slowly, the climate grew cooler and drier. Forests shrank. Grasslands spread. Animals adapted or died out. That pressure shaped the apes too. That's where Ouranopithecus came in. They lived right in the middle of this change, in Greece and Macedonia, where the forests were giving way to open lands. Their heavy jaws and strong teeth told the story of survival in tougher times. While some apes depended only on soft forest fruits, Ouranopithecus could chew harder, drier foods. They were like survivors carrying a toolkit for the future. I wondered if they knew the world around them was shrinking. Did they sense the forests fading year by year? Probably not. But maybe they felt it in small ways: longer walks to find food, fewer safe trees to rest in, more moments staring out at open grass where predators roamed. Change wasn't sudden, but it was steady, and those who adapted lived. One evening, when I sat on my balcony looking at the city lights, I thought about how different my world was from theirs. But then I noticed something: we also live in times of change. The climate shifts, animals vanish, and we have to adapt in our own way. Maybe the feeling of being caught between worlds, between forest and grassland for them, between old ways and new ways for us, isn't so different after all. In the Miocene, the land was alive with more than just apes. Huge creatures roamed the earth. There were ancient elephants with strange tusks, rhinos bigger than trucks, and antelopes that moved in great herds. Some were familiar, like horses, though smaller and wilder than today's. Others were strange, creatures with shapes and horns I had never seen before. Predators stalked them too. Big cats, bear-like carnivores, and even packs of hyena-like beasts prowled the land. For an ape like Ouranopithecus, the world was dangerous. They had no sharp claws, no speed to outrun hunters. Their best defense was caution: eyes scanning the horizon, ears tuned to every sound, and hands ready to climb back to the safety of trees. And yet, they endured. I like to think of one Ouranopithecus group finding a patch of fruit trees near the edge of the forest. They would gather, breaking open nuts, chewing slowly, keeping watch as the younger ones played. The sun would dip lower, shadows stretching, and the sounds of night would creep in. They would climb higher, building nests of branches, curling together as the stars filled the sky. The stars. That's what struck me most. Because no matter how long ago it was, the stars above them would have been the same ones I see now. Different continents, different creatures, but the same endless sky. Maybe that's why the scientists gave them that name, ape of the heavens. Sometimes, I felt like the Miocene was whispering to me. Not just through books or fossils, but through the idea that we are part of something much older, something that began long before humans built cities or told stories. Ouranopithecus was only one voice in that whisper, but it was enough to make me listen. The Miocene ended long before humans ever appeared, but its echoes are still here. In our bones. In the way we walk. In the way we think. We are living chapters written by apes who learned to survive in a world of change. And as I turned another page in my mind, I felt the pull of the next story, the one that would lead from the forgotten apes of Greece toward the more familiar faces of Africa, where the roots of true humans would one day take hold. When I thought about Ouranopithecus in Greece, I felt like I was watching a branch of the family tree stretching far to the north, reaching for sunlight. But the more I read, the more I realized something: the deepest roots of our story weren't in Europe. They were in Africa. That idea pulled at me. It was like the tree of life had spread its arms wide, but the trunk, the heart of it all, was still in one place. Africa wasn't just another continent, it was where the first sparks of our line would eventually glow. But the road back wasn't simple. It was full of twists and turns, full of creatures whose names most people had never heard. I imagined a time, after Ouranopithecus had lived and passed, when the climate kept changing. The Miocene world grew drier, and the forests pulled back even more. The apes who depended only on thick jungle began to vanish. Some, like Dryopithecus in Europe, may have disappeared completely. Others, like SavageTouch in Asia, survived for a while, their features echoing what we now see in orangutans. But in Africa, something different was brewing. There were apes like Kenyapithecus and later Nicolipithecus, both with features that made scientists lean forward, wondering, could these be closer to the ancestors of humans? Their teeth were tougher, their jaws stronger, and they seemed more at home in the drier woodlands than the deep forests. They reminded me of Ouranopithecus, like distant cousins facing the same challenges in a different land. I pictured the African woodlands then, not the dense rainforests we usually imagine, but scattered trees, patches of shade, and wide spaces where the sun blazed. The air was filled with buzzing insects, the calls of birds, and the heavy sound of hooves as herds passed by. For apes living there, life wasn't about swinging gracefully through endless trees. It was about learning to move across the ground, to adapt to a mixed world of forest and grass. That thought made me shiver. Because moving on the ground, spending more time upright, was a step toward us. It wasn't full walking yet, not like humans, but it was a beginning. One night, as I sat at my desk with the old magazine open, I traced the pictures with my finger. The skulls looked rough, broken, sometimes just a piece of jaw or a handful of teeth. Yet from those fragments, scientists painted a picture of entire worlds. It amazed me how much could be seen in a single tooth: the shape, the wear, the strength. A tooth could tell you what an ape ate, where it lived, how it survived. It made me wonder, what would someone in the far future think if they found one of my teeth? Would they know what kind of food I liked? Would they guess the city I lived in, the air I breathed? Fossils felt like secret diaries written in bone. The more I imagined those African apes, the more I saw the story tightening. Europe had once been full of apes like Ouranopithecus and Dryopithecus, but as the climate shifted, their world faded. Africa, though it still held onto its apes, shaping them slowly into something new. I thought of a female Nicolipithecus sitting on a rock, her young clinging to her chest. She would look out at the open land, her eyes sharp, her teeth strong enough to break the hard seeds she gathered. Around her, the sounds of hoofed animals filled the air. She wasn't yet human, but she carried the weight of the future without knowing it. Sometimes, when I walked through the crowded streets of my city, I imagined them walking beside me. Not as apes in the wild, but as echoes in the way people moved, the way someone leaned forward when curious, or stood upright with pride, or laughed with their whole body. Maybe pieces of them are still in us, hidden but alive. The scientists argued about details, about which fossil was closer to humans and which was only a cousin. But for me, the exact answer didn't matter as much as the picture itself. What I saw was a chain, not a straight chain, but one with many links twisting and breaking, reconnecting in unexpected ways. Ouranopithecus in Greece, Dryopithecus in Europe, SavageTouch in Asia, Nicolipithecus in Africa, all part of a sprawling family that tried, failed, and sometimes succeeded in carving out a future. And then came the thought that made my heart race: what if Ouranopithecus, or something like it, had actually wandered back into Africa? Some scientists suggested that possibility that apes from Europe or Asia might have returned south and mixed with those in Africa, carrying new traits that would eventually lead to humans. If that was true, then maybe the ape of the heavens wasn't just a forgotten cousin. Maybe it was a traveler, a messenger, carrying part of the story back home. I liked that idea. It made me think of rivers flowing back to their source, or birds migrating across oceans to return to the place where their story began. Maybe evolution wasn't just about moving forward, but about circling back, weaving old threads into new ones. When I thought of it that way, I felt less alone. Because sometimes, in my own life, I wondered if the things I loved, like imagining stories about the past, really mattered. But maybe the past always circles back, feeding the present in ways we can't always see. As the Miocene ended and the next epoch began, many ape species disappeared. Their forests were gone, their world too harsh. But in Africa, some survived. And those survivors carried in their bones the seeds of something entirely new. They weren't yet human. Not even close. But they were on the road. And as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized I was already waiting for the next chapter, the one where the first true ancestors of humans would rise, walking upright under the same stars that once shone on the ape of the heavens. I always thought walking on two legs was the most normal thing in the world. Everyone does it. We don't even think about it. We stand, we walk, we run. But when I began to read more about human evolution, I realized that this simple act, this everyday thing, was one of the most important steps in our history. And the ones who first carried that step proudly weren't yet human. They were Australopithecus. The name means southern ape, because their fossils were found in Africa, especially in places like Ethiopia, Tanzania, and South Africa. They lived around 4 to 2 million years ago, much later than Ouranopithecus, but still far before the first real humans. What made them different wasn't just their bones or their faces. It was the way they moved. I imagined one Australopithecus female stepping out into the morning light. The grass was wet with dew, shining under the sun. She carried herself differently than the apes of the Miocene. Her spine curved gently, her pelvis tilted in a way that balanced her body upright. She could walk on 2 feet, not just for a few steps, but for long stretches across the land. Her hands were free to carry food, free to hold tools, free to cradle her child. That moment, the freeing of the hands, felt like magic to me. Because it meant possibility. With hands no longer chained to the ground, new worlds opened. Scientists found proof of their walking in a place called Laetali in Tanzania. There, millions of years ago, a group of Australopithecus walked across soft volcanic ash. Rain hardened the ash into stone, and their footprints stayed frozen in time. When I read about it, I couldn't believe it. Footprints that old, still there to see. I pictured it, 2 adults and maybe a child, walking side by side. Their steps were clear, one after another, a trail stretching forward. When I saw photos of those prints, it gave me chills. It was like shaking hands with the past, like seeing ghosts that still whispered, "We were here. We walked before you." I thought about my own feet, the way they pressed against the floor as I moved through my house. My footprints vanished in seconds. But theirs lasted for millions of years. That's how important they were. But Australopithecus wasn't just about walking. They were still apes in many ways: small brains, long arms, and faces that looked different from ours. Yet inside them was a spark, a bridge between what came before and what would come after. One of the most famous fossils was a skeleton discovered in Ethiopia, nicknamed Lucy. She lived over 3 million years ago. When scientists pieced her bones together, they saw the same thing: she could walk upright. I imagined Lucy standing in the sun, her shadow stretching behind her, not knowing she would one day become famous, not knowing she carried the secret of our stride. I like to think of her not as a fossil, but as a living being. Maybe she climbed trees at night to sleep safely, but during the day she walked across the ground with her group. Maybe she laughed, made sounds to call to her family, and searched for fruits or roots to eat. She wasn't human, but she wasn't entirely an ape either. She was something new. The scientists said her brain was still small, about the size of a chimpanzee's. But I wondered, what did she see when she looked at the horizon? Did she feel curiosity, like I do when I look at the night sky? Did she ever stop and just watch the world around her? Walking upright gave her a new view. Standing tall meant seeing farther, spotting predators in the grass, finding food at a distance. It also meant carrying things, stones, sticks, or even food for her young. And carrying things meant the start of tools, even if they were simple. Maybe a sharp stone to cut meat. Maybe a stick to dig roots. Small steps, but steps that would lead to everything humans would later create. One afternoon, as I sat in the park, I watched people walk by. Some hurried, some strolled, some carried heavy bags, some pushed strollers. And I thought about how normal it all seemed. Yet every step we take carries the memory of those ancient footprints at Laetali. Every bag we hold, every tool we use, is possible because once, long ago, an ape stood up and kept walking. Australopithecus wasn't alone, either. There were different kinds, Australopithecus afarensis like Lucy, Australopithecus africanus in South Africa, and others. Each lived in slightly different times and places, each carrying the experiment of walking a little further. Together, they shaped the path that would eventually lead to us. I sometimes imagined Lucy's group walking in the evening, the sky turning orange. They would chatter in their own way, moving together for safety. The young ones would play, chasing each other, while the adults kept watch. They had no idea that millions of years later, a boy would sit with a book in his lap and dream about them. That was what amazed me most, they didn't know they were history. To them, life was just survival, finding food, keeping safe, raising young. They weren't trying to make footprints for the future. But they left them anyway. And those prints became part of us. It made me think of my own life. Sometimes I wondered if what I did really mattered. But maybe the truth is, everything matters, even the smallest steps. Lucy never knew she would inspire scientists. The Laetali walkers never knew their footprints would be studied by children like me. Maybe the same is true for us. We never know which of our steps will echo into the future. Australopithecus wasn't human. But without them, humans wouldn't exist. They were the bridge, the first walkers, the ones who carried the story forward. And as I closed my book and looked at my own footprints in the dust of the street, I felt connected to them. Step by step, we were still walking together. When I first held a smooth stone in my hand, I thought of it only as a stone. But when I read about our ancestors, I realized that at some point in history, someone like me held a stone and saw something more. A tool. A weapon. A beginning. That moment, the moment when stone became tool, was one of the greatest turning points in our story. And the creatures who began it weren't quite like us yet, but they carried the name we now share, Homo. The earliest was Homo habilis, meaning handy man. They lived in Africa around 2.4 to 1.5 million years ago, and scientists say they were the first real tool makers. Not just picking up sticks or stones by chance, like earlier apes may have done, but shaping them, sharpening them, giving them purpose. I closed my eyes and imagined the scene. A group of Homo habilis sat near a riverbank. One of them picked up a rough stone, held it against another, and struck. The sharp crack echoed in the air. A piece broke away, leaving an edge. Not smooth anymore, but sharp, dangerous, useful. He tested it on a branch, slicing through bark. Others watched, their eyes bright. For the first time, nature wasn't just something to endure, it was something they could shape. It amazed me to think about that. Because everything I see around me, cars, phones, books, even the chair I sit on, exists because long ago, someone broke a stone and realized it could cut. That spark lit the path to invention, to technology, to civilization itself. But Homo habilis wasn't only about tools. Their brains were bigger than Australopithecus, though still much smaller than ours. Their faces still looked more ape-like, their arms long, their bodies small. Yet inside their skulls, something was stirring: imagination, planning, memory. I wondered what they thought about at night, sitting around a fire. Though some scientists say fire came a little later, maybe with Homo erectus. Did they dream? Did they remember the day's hunt, the taste of food, the sound of the river? Did they tell stories, even if only with gestures and cries? The fossils told pieces of their life. Skulls from Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, tools scattered across ancient landscapes, bones of animals with marks from sharp stone cuts. Those marks told a silent story. These creatures weren't just scavengers. They were learning to carve meat, to break bones for marrow, to use their tools to survive. That thought gave me goosebumps. Because marrow hidden inside bones was food that many predators left behind. By breaking bones open, Homo habilis tapped into a new resource, one that required cleverness, patience, and strength. They were learning not just to eat, but to think differently about eating. Sometimes, I thought about myself at lunch in school. I opened a packet, unwrapped food, bit into it without effort. And then I thought of Homo habilis, squatting in the dust, striking stones together, breaking bones, scraping meat. Their lunch was a battle of survival. But without their struggle, my easy meal wouldn't exist. Homo habilis wasn't alone in Africa. Around the same time, there were other hominins, some older Australopithecus still hanging on, others fading away. It was like a crowded stage, with many actors trying out their roles. Some would disappear, their lines forgotten. But Homo habilis was different. Their role grew louder, more important. They were carrying the story forward. I imagined a child of Homo habilis watching an adult make tools. The child's eyes would follow every movement, the way mine follow when I watch someone build something. Maybe the child reached out, picked up a stone, and tried. Maybe the strike was clumsy, the edge dull. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the learning, the passing on of knowledge. That was the birth of culture, not just surviving, but teaching, sharing, remembering. And culture meant memory. Memory meant connection. And connection meant future. Scientists sometimes debated whether Homo habilis really belonged in the Homo genus or if they were just advanced Australopithecus. But to me, the name didn't matter as much as the idea. What mattered was that they stood at a threshold. Behind them were apes who walked upright but lived mostly as nature shaped them. Ahead of them were humans who would shape nature itself. I sat on my bed one evening, a book on my lap, and picked up a pebble I'd found outside. I turned it in my hand, tried to imagine seeing it the way Homo habilis once did, not just a pebble, but a possibility. For a second, I almost felt it. The weight of the past pressed into my palm. The next great step after Homo habilis would be Homo erectus, the true wanderers, the fire makers, the ones who spread far beyond Africa. But without Homo habilis, there would be no Homo erectus. Without that first strike of stone, there would be no spark of civilization. As I placed the pebble back on my desk, I thought of all the things we hold today: pens, phones, tools, keys. All of them are echoes of that first stone. And somewhere, deep in the dust of Africa, the marks of those first tools still wait, silent proof that once, long ago, an ape's hand turned into a human hand. When I read about Homo erectus, I couldn't stop thinking of the word adventure. Because if Homo habilis was the one who first picked up a stone and shaped it, then Homo erectus was the one who first looked at the horizon and decided to follow it. They appeared around 1.9 million years ago and survived for almost 2 million years longer than any other human species ever did. That thought alone blew my mind. We've only been around for about 300,000 years, but they walked this earth for nearly 2 million. They were tough, clever, and restless. The first thing that stood out about them was their bodies. Unlike Homo habilis, who were still short and a bit ape-like, Homo erectus had longer legs, shorter arms, and bodies that could handle long walks and hot climates. They were built for travel. And travel they did. From Africa, they spread into Asia, Indonesia, China, the Middle East, and even into parts of Europe. I imagined a group of them moving slowly across open grasslands, carrying tools, children, maybe food. Step by step, they crossed rivers, mountains, and deserts, reaching lands no human had ever seen before. That moment, I realized, was the beginning of us becoming explorers. Before maps, before ships, before airplanes, there were feet. And Homo erectus used theirs to discover the world. But walking wasn't their only achievement. They were the first to master something I can't imagine life without: fire. At first, maybe it was just a wild flame from a lightning strike or a forest fire. They might have stood at the edge, afraid, watching sparks dance in the dark. But then one of them grew brave. They carried a burning branch, maybe to keep animals away. Then someone figured out how to keep it alive, feeding it with dry grass, sticks, and logs. And finally, after who knows how many tries, they learned to start it themselves. I pictured a small circle of Homo erectus gathered around their first fire. The flickering light pushed back the night, shadows stretched across their faces. For the first time, they weren't helpless when the sun went down. Fire gave them safety, warmth, and cooked food. It gave them something else too: time. Time to sit together in the night, to share, to look at the stars. Sometimes, when I sit by a campfire on school trips, I stare into the flames and think, this is the same magic they once felt. That same orange glow connected me to them. And then there were their tools. Homo habilis had made rough, simple stones. But Homo erectus made Acheulean hand axes, large, tear-shaped tools sharpened on both sides. To me, they looked almost like giant stone leaves. They weren't just practical, they were symmetrical, balanced. Making one took patience, skill, and imagination. Some archaeologists even believe they weren't always about survival, they might have been about showing skill, like art, or pride. That thought gave me chills. Because if that's true, then creativity, the thing that makes humans paint, write, and build, was already alive in Homo erectus. Their brains were bigger too, about twice the size of Australopithecus, though still smaller than ours. With those brains, they hunted better, planned better, and adapted to all kinds of environments. One fossil from Georgia, in a place called Dmanisi, showed that Homo erectus cared for each other. Scientists found a skull of an old individual who had lost almost all their teeth but had lived for years afterward. That meant others must have helped them, sharing food, protecting them. It wasn't just survival of the fittest, it was survival of the kindest too. That made me pause. Because kindness, to me, feels like one of the most human things of all. Homo erectus didn't just survive, they thrived. In Indonesia, fossils of them were found on the island of Java. In China, at a site called Zhoukoudian, they left behind tools, bones, and traces of fire. They had turned from African apes into global wanderers. But what really stayed with me was the thought of how they saw the world. Imagine standing on a cliff in Asia, looking at a valley full of animals you'd never seen before: giant deer, strange birds, forests stretching out forever. To us, that's discovery. To them, it was simply life. They were writing the first lines of the human adventure without even knowing it. Sometimes, when I walk to school, I think of them. Each step I take on pavement, they once took on soil, grass, or sand. My shoes protect me, but they walked barefoot, feeling the earth directly. They followed rivers, tracks of animals, paths of the sun. And slowly, step by step, they stitched together the map of the world. I realized something then: Homo erectus was more like us than any ancestor before. They looked more like us, acted more like us, thought more like us. They weren't just surviving in one small corner, they were reaching, exploring, building, and sharing. They were becoming human in ways we can still feel in ourselves. And yet, like every chapter before, their time eventually ended. Other humans would come, new species with new skills. But their legacy never disappeared. Every time we walk far, light a fire, or shape something with our hands, we're echoing them. I closed my book that night and looked at my own hands. Longer fingers, softer skin, but deep inside, the same bones as theirs. I held a small lighter I'd found in the kitchen, clicked it, and watched the flame spark. In that tiny flicker, I saw 2 million years of history, stretching from their campfires to my desk. Homo erectus wasn't just a species. They were the first great wanderers, the keepers of fire, the carriers of courage. And because of them, the world was no longer a place to fear, it was a place to explore.